This is the ZowieTek 4K POV camera, and it's called ZowieCam. So I'm gonna unbox it quickly. So there's a quick start guide, USB-C to USB-C cable, a power charger, adapter, and cold shoe mount. So there's I think a 1/4" 20 on this side and a cold shoe on this side. And then there's the camera itself. So the camera is a really small cube. It's almost like 5 centimeters on each side. To be exact, the dimensions are 5.56 centimeters by 5.2 centimeters by 4.77 centimeters. So almost 5 centimeters in all dimensions. And on the back, there's an Ethernet port, which can be used for NDI, and it also supports power over Ethernet. And there's a HDMI port for outputting the visuals. And there's also an SDI port. The SDI port supports 3G SDI. And then the USB-C port is to power the device. And then here you have audio in. And there you have a joystick type of button, which can be used to adjust different things such as exposure or shutter speed. So it depends on how we configure this camera. The buttons can be used slightly differently. And there's an LED here, which is used to show the power status of the camera. So if the device is on, then this LED should be on as well. And then on the front, there's the lens itself. So this is the default lens that comes with it. So the lens mount is an M12 with autofocus lens mount, and it's a 7mm lens, f2.2. So in terms of micro four thirds, it would be the equivalent of a 25mm standard lens. And the diagonal angle of view is 48.3, and the horizontal angle of view is 42.6, and the vertical angle of view is 24.6 degrees. And on the front, there's 2 tally lights. And on top, there's a 1/4" 20 thread. And on the bottom, we also have a 1/4" 20 thread, as well as the fan is here. So that's where it either pulls in air or pushes out air. And then on both sides, there's vents to, I guess, to help with the air intake or outlet. So there's 3 1/4" 20 threads on 3 sides of the camera. So on top, on this side, and on the bottom. So there's only one side where there isn't a 1/4" 20 thread. So the main features of this camera is that, first of all, it supports 4K, and it also allows streaming. So you can stream over RTMP, and the maximum power that it uses will be 12 watts, which is relatively low. So you can support it with a power bank. And it also supports the typical ZowieUI, so you can log into it through the Ethernet port to the web interface and then configure it to stream or use it however you want to do. And you also have the HDMI output if you wanted to use that, or the SDI. So the advantage of this camera is that it's tiny in comparison to carrying a camera as well as an encoder if you want to use it for streaming. So you can connect the Ethernet cable there, configure it, and then stream with it directly. The only thing I would say is probably the default lens that comes with it is a 7mm or 25mm kind of standard lens. So if you change that to a wide angle lens, that would probably be more appropriate for most of the scenarios. So this is a lot easier to carry and mount somewhere if you want to use it for live streaming. And it's an encoder as well as a camera, so you can do everything within this single box. You have the lens, the camera, the encoder, and the transmitter. So the only thing you really need is to have connection to internet, and then you can transmit the data. And there's 3 versions of this POV camera. In fact, I actually mentioned here on the box, I don't know if you can see this, but there's the M12 and there's the M12 with autofocus, which is the one I have here, and there is the CS. So depending on the mount that you want, then I guess you can choose which one you want, and then whether you want autofocus. So there's two versions with M12 mount, one with autofocus and one without autofocus. So I just want to show these type of clamps, which are really useful if you want to connect a light camera. So here you have a 1/4" 20, which you can attach to this camera, and then you can use this clamp to attach the camera pretty much anywhere where you have the option to attach it. So if you're in a sports hall, you can connect it high up, or if you're in a even outdoor sports court where they have fences around it, you can connect this to the fence or a pole or anywhere which you can think you can connect it to. And since this is so light, in fact it weighs 166 grams, so the weight is insignificant. You can just use this and connect it, and you can, you know, turn this, keep the angle at whatever angle you want, and have the camera connected in whatever direction you want. So just something to keep in mind if you want to use these cameras together with these type of clamps. It's really easy to use them instead of considering, for example, having a stand or a tripod or anything like that. So I try to keep everything as small as possible. In terms of the charger, it's a USB-C charger, and the output is 5 volts at 3 amps or 9 volts at 2.77 amps or 12 volts at 2.1 amps. So the reason I mentioned the voltage and the current is because if you want to use this device with a power bank, for example, if you have it connected remotely somewhere where you don't have access to power, then you can make sure that your power bank can support, for example, 5 volts with up to 3 amps or 9 volts at 2.7, and then you know that it would be okay to operate the camera. And the camera uses less than 12 watts of power altogether, so probably you would get away with a power bank that even supplies 5 volts at 2.4 amps. And with this, I'm not sure that what the purpose of this is. I suspect maybe the consideration is that you connect it here and then to a cold shoe, additional peripheral. Okay, so I'm gonna connect it to the Ethernet port and power, and then continue this from the web interface. Before I connect this up and start going through all the features of it, I'm gonna quickly rush through the spec of the camera. So it has a Sony Ultra-HD 4K back-illuminated and stacked 1/2.3 inch sensor, and it has auto exposure with zone option, and you have the option to automatically manually adjust the color temperature, as well as having a single push white balance, and it also supports image freezing. And the streaming bitrate that it supports is 50 megabits per second, which is really good. And it supports NDI, HX, RTSP, SRT, and RTMP streaming up to 4K 30. So depending on how you want to use it, maybe you want to use it as 4K 30 or maybe 1080p at 60 frames per second instead. So for example, if you're shooting sports, then 1080p at 60 frames per second might be a better option. And the other thing is that you always need to consider when it comes to streaming is the upload bandwidth that you have available to you. So for example, if you're using 4G or 5G, then the bandwidth will be the bottleneck as opposed to the 50 megabits per second bitrate that this camera provides. Another thing worth mentioning about this camera is that the camera can output both HDMI at 4K with 3G SDI at the same time. So you can have two outputs from this at the same time. And with the 1/4" 20 mount, you can mount it either as a horizontal, landscape camera as well as a vertical one. And the camera has gravity sensor in it, so it can automatically detect whether you're shooting vertically or horizontally. The effective pixels of this sensor is 8 megapixels, so it supports the full K resolution 3840 by 2160. So that's the full K 16:9 resolution. And the electronic shutter goes from 1/25 all the way up to 1/10,000. And the color temperature ranges between 3000 and 6500. In terms of exposure, the camera supports auto exposure as well as shutter priority and manual mode. So since this is a small camera with a small lens. You don't have the option to obviously change the aperture. So that's why you don't have aperture priority. The lens itself weighs 16 grams. And the camera can encode both at H.265 and H.264 with both constant bitrate and variable bitrate. The Ethernet port is a 1 gigabit Ethernet port, so you won't have any issues with connectivity in terms of the bandwidth. The NDI version it supports is 5.5. The HDMI out is HDMI 1.4B with 422 subsampling, and the SDI is 3G SDI, again with 422. So since this also is supported by the ZowieUI web app, it also provides text and logo caption overlays. This one actually supports the same scoreboard overlays that the ZowieTek encoder provides. This would actually be more useful than having an encoder on its own, because there you have the camera, the encoder, the streaming device all in a tiny box, which is easier to carry, and you could also update the scores for a sporting event. And like other ZowieTek devices, the firmware is upgradable, so it's worth checking that you have the latest version of the firmware, and I will do the same once I connect everything. Okay, so I'm gonna connect the Ethernet cable here, and I'm also going to connect the USB-C power, which is this USB-C here. So it turns on immediately, and you see the LED there, which is red. So what I will do is point it in this direction and take off the lens cover. So I'm gonna point the camera in this direction and then go to the computer and configure it from there. I entered the IP address of the ZowieCam into the web browser to reach this page, and I did try to enter the name, which was ZowieCam-15820.local, but that didn't work for me, so I had to enter the IP address for it. And the way I found the IP address was to connect to my router and see the list of devices that were connected to my router, and then I took the IP address from there. So the username should be admin and the password should be admin as well. So I will click remember this and log in. Once you log in, this is the first screen that you see, and this is the control screen. So this is the screen that you use when everything is up and running and someone is just controlling the interface. So here you have different things that you can do, whether it's the recording, the overlays, different ways to control exposure, focus, and you also have a bunch of presets. So you can save different presets here and then record them during the streaming. But before you can use this effectively, you have to actually go and configure each of these things so that when you're running a live stream event, you can just click on the appropriate button and have what you want to happen. So we can come back to that in a bit, but essentially once you've configured everything in the web application, which reflects what's saved on the device itself, then you can control the camera and what you want to do here. So you set up different things, what overlays you want, how you want it to function. So I have the manual of the ZowieCam sitting in front of the camera itself. So there's a bunch of different options here and a bunch of options on the right hand side. So you can enable audio or disable it, make it full screen. This button allows you to zoom in digitally, and you can also zoom out using this button. And I think this should be to rotate the orientation, as you can see. And this should be to move the image. So if you, I guess, zoom in and then use this, then you can get the portion of the screen that you want. But I will zoom out and just leave it as the... Okay, so this seems to be like a reset. So I'm going to go into settings. So this is the dashboard, so you get all the different information about the camera and the unit. And I've gone through this interface, the Zowie interface previously. So if you want, you can watch that video so you know what all the different things are that you get here. So the interface between all these different streaming devices that ZowieTek provides are very similar. So you have the dashboard here with all the high-level information, and then you have the camera. So this is the camera image, and here you have the focus options. So here you can calibrate the focus. You can adjust exposure and change all the different options that it has here. The metering modes, for example, backlit, flickering. So you can choose what you want depending on the place you are. So for example, if I was to record indoors in the UK, I would choose 50 because that's the frequency of the electricity. And then you have backlight. So that obviously helps the camera decide how to expose the shot. And then you have exposure compensation and the mode that you want. So you could do everything manual as well. Here you can choose how you want the color to be and the white balance. And you can also have one push white balance so that once it's correct, you push it and lock it at that particular value. And then again, more information about how to set up the image. So you can crop it, flip it, and adjust these settings. And then here you can choose the noise reduction level. So 3D noise reduction is better than the 2D, particularly for moving subjects, and it won't leave a trail, but it will still remove a reasonable amount of noise. And then you have the style, so you can choose how you want it to be. So I've just left it as default. And here you can control the tally light, so you can enable it or disable it, set it to auto or manual. So if you're working in a studio environment, this could be useful so that the talent in front of the camera knows when the camera is operating. And these are the information for the codec that you want to use for streaming. So ideally, I would like to use H.265 with the highest profile, which gives the maximum compression at a constant bitrate. And I would want a low bitrate to allow me to stream over a 4G connection. And I'm going to set it to 25 frames per second and the iframe to update once every second, so every 25 frames. I won't bother with the secondary stream because I won't be using that. So I'm going to save it. So it takes some time to save this because all of this information is being saved on the device itself. And here you can choose the output format. So I actually want to do 1080p with 30 frames per second because I find that to be a good option for live streaming. So even though I live in a PAL location, I still prefer the 30 frames per second for live streaming. So I'm going to save it. And I need to go back to encoder to change this. Oh, okay. So when I updated that, it automatically updated this and it set the frame interval to 60. I will change this to 30 because I want one iframe every second. I think if you're filming moving subjects, then you want one iframe at least once every second. If the shot is static, then I think you can get away with one iframe every 2 seconds, but for a moving scene, one iframe per second should be good, or the minimum anyway. So I'll save that again. And here we have the output, the overlays. So I'm gonna, okay, so one of the things is on this page, if you have H.265 enabled, you won't be able to use this page to see the video footage. So maybe for the purpose of this exercise, I will set this to H.264 so that we can actually see the output of the video while we configure different things on the overlay screen. Okay, so now you can see the image being captured by the camera. And you can add a canvas. So I will say 4K, and I think that's all I will say. So this is a 4K canvas. Okay, so here you can see what happened here. I have the canvas as 4K, but my encoder is doing 1080p. So it squeezed it down to 1080p. So I need to decide whether I want to stream in 1080p or 4K so that I can work effectively with this. I will delete this canvas and see if I can create another canvas at 1080p, because that's what I'm streaming at. So it doesn't make sense to have a canvas which is bigger than the screen area which I will be streaming in. So I'll confirm that, and now you see that it takes up the full screen. So if you decide to stream at 4K, then you need to have all the configurations set at 4K. And if you want to stream at 1080p, then have it configured as 1080p for all the different settings. So here you have the option to add some text. For example, subscribe to my channel. And I think the text is black, so let me put a white background and have it as bold. Increase the size so that I can actually see it. There it is. In fact, what would have been better is if I set the text to white and the background to black and set the opacity to 50% and then confirm. So you have that there. It could be any color, and you can also add an image if you want to, and you can add a scoreboard. So scores, and you click on each different component here so that you can set something. So for example here, sport league, and then team A and team B, and you can choose the different colors. So let's just say you wanted team B to be red, you could do that. And you can also have something here, so you can choose an image for it for each team. Or if you actually don't want the image and you don't want that part, you can just hide it to make things a bit smaller, I guess. And if I click here, you can do the same thing here. And for team A, we could, for example, set this to blue. In fact, I will set this manually. So you have the red team and the blue team there. And this part as well, I will hide it. So is there a save button there? Yeah, confirm. So that's the scoreboard. I think I need to make this substantially bigger. So I think the scoreboard is made for a 4K resolution, and that's why it's smaller on this. So I'm going to come to scale and scale it by 4 times, which is the difference between 4K and 1080p. And then confirm. Okay, so this is the size that I guess it would be under normal circumstances if I had decided to stream at 4K. Now, another thing which would be good to do is to increase the transparency of everything here, so that if there's some action happening beneath this, you can actually see it. So if I click on this part and background, set the transparency to 0.5, which is 50%. So it will be a little bit see-through. And again here. So the background has 2 colors, which is the starting color on this part and the ending color there. So it's a gradient. And that's why you have 2 options here for the background. And here, there's no option to set the transparency for the background. So I think that's fine. So now this should be a little bit more see-through. So if you look here, you can see a little bit through this. and that might be enough to help with the audience being able to watch the sport action happening. And here you have the audio, so you can choose the line in. So that seems to be the only option. So I assume this camera doesn't actually have a onboard microphone. You actually have to attach a microphone to it for the sound to be recorded. And for streaming, you have these options if you want to use local streaming with RTSP. And for live streaming, you can add what you want. So I would typically be using RTMP, and I would add the YouTube URL and stream key with the description. So to my knowledge, this device doesn't have an option for recording because you can't attach a memory to it. So there's no place for a memory slot. But I think the user interface is the shared user interface, which is called the ZowieUI. And that's the same user interface which all the ZowieTek devices share. So that's why the option is still there. And then NDI, I won't be using NDI, so I will skip that part. And here you can see the LAN, so my IP address and my local network. And these are the default ports for connecting to various servers. So for RTMP, you can see the default port here. So you typically don't want to change these. And this is the name of the device, and you can change it. I didn't actually manage to access the device using this name, so I just used the IP address. And I'm not sure what the options are for NAS with this device, but I don't use a NAS. And here you can choose the language. So I'm going to set that to English and save that. And then NDI, user management, time, I will set this to Dublin, London, save this. And this is the firmware which my device is using, 1.0.2.27. So again, I would say to check the firmware that you have on your device, because the newer versions have in particular the options for scoreboard, and that's quite useful if you're streaming sports. So here you can see the overlay created with 1080p. So you can choose, for example, to switch this on, and then you have that particular overlay on your stream. And if you click it again, it will switch it off. And you could have more overlays as well. So if you think about this device in comparison to the ZowieTek encoder, this is actually smaller and lighter than the ZowieTek encoder, and it has a camera. So it eliminates the need for connecting an external camera to the device. So you can just have this tiny box and you can use it as a camera to stream the footage, as well as use it for the scoreboard. So you can add the overlays and manage the overlays, and you can also do the streaming with it. So you can add your RTMP live streaming here. So actually, in terms of carrying less equipment and achieving the same result, I think this device is actually smaller and lighter and might be more practical in a lot of scenarios. Obviously, there's some differences in using a proper camera with a large lens and large sensor, but if you don't mind using a smaller sensor and a smaller lens, then this option is, I think, more portable and practical in a lot of scenarios. And aside from the device itself, if you just have to power one unit which has a camera as well as the encoding and the networking functionality for streaming, then you need less power to run the whole unit, which means you need to carry less power banks, for example. Whereas if you had to have a camera and a streaming device and the connections to it as well, so additional cables, there will be a lot more to carry, as well as the additional batteries that you need to carry for each of those devices. So in that sense, it would be a more practical option. So what I'm going to try to do now is stream to YouTube. Okay, so I went into the streaming setup and I've added the details for live streaming to YouTube. So you can see the RTMP server URL for YouTube, and that's the key for that particular stream, which I've also entered here. So it's just a different format of entering it separately. Instead of asking the device to put the URL together, I've just entered everything into the URL. And on the video side, on the overlays, I've just added some overlays so that we can see something on the screen. So now if we go to the live option here, so this is the control screen. So we can switch on the overlays, the 1080p one, for example. And it's good to keep in mind to keep the names short and in a way that you can identify them, so that if you have multiple different overlays, you can switch them on and off quite easily using these buttons here. So I'm going to switch on the overlays, and you can see the message which says on. So the overlays are on, and the test stream that I created, I'm going to click on that to start the live streaming. So that's come on now as well, which means we are live streaming with the overlays. And if I go to my YouTube studio, you can see that it says excellent connection, and it takes some time for the video footage to show up. Previously, when I've tested this, it usually takes about 17 seconds. Okay, so there you can see the scoreboard and the graphic here, as well as the text I added. So one thing I want to try before I end the live stream is to disconnect the device from the network while the live stream setting is on, so that the live stream here stops completely, and then reconnect the device without actually doing anything else to see if it automatically starts the live stream. Because if you can do that, then you don't actually need an external computer or phone or something to connect to this. You can just plug it in and it will start streaming straight away. Anyway, I will leave this live stream running, and I'm going to disconnect the device and then reconnect it to see if the live stream comes back up online or not. Okay, so I switched off the device, and as you can see, the live stream has gone offline. So without connecting to the box, I'm going to switch on the device again and see if the live stream automatically comes back on, or whether I need to do some manual intervention for it to start working again. Okay, so I connected the device again, so the device is switched on. So I'm just waiting for it to see whether the live streaming will start up again. So assuming it takes maybe 30 seconds for the box to boot up, and then it will probably take another 17 seconds or 20 seconds for the live stream to establish its connection and for the video footage to appear. I think waiting for about 1 minute would be a reasonable time to expect it to go up. But as you can see, it already says excellent connection, which means that the stream has reconnected itself without me intervening. And as you can see now, the video footage is up as well. So you can switch off the device, switch it back on, and it will continue streaming. So in order to stop the streaming, you either have to switch the device off or go into the user interface and then switch it off there. So I have to log back in again because I restarted the device. So let me go back in. Streaming live. So here you can see this is still online. So I will switch this off, and now that's offline. And in relation to this, another comparison I want to make between this camera and the ZowieBox, which is the encoder from ZowieTek, is that ZowieBox, which is the encoder, has a Wi-Fi module, which means you can connect to it with a phone using Wi-Fi, and you can also have it plugged into the Ethernet port. Whereas with this camera, you don't have a Wi-Fi module, so you cannot connect to the camera over Wi-Fi. So you need to have an Ethernet cable going into the camera to connect to it. So you can always get a USB-C to Ethernet adapter and then connect your phone that way. And your phone could act as a modem for essentially sending data for streaming, as well as connecting to the device itself to, for example, update the scoreboard if you wanted to. So the encoder does have certain advantages. So you can insert a memory stick in it. It has place for a micro SD card. It does have a lot more options, but it's also bigger. So depending on which features you want and what compromises you want to make, one or the other one could be more suitable for that purpose. So one thing I wanted to mention is that there's 3 versions of this camera, and there is one which has a CS mount, and there's a lens available for that, which is 5 to 50 millimeter. So I think that camera together with that lens is more practical because you have the option to zoom in and out, even though it's manual. And ZowieTek actually sells this lens, and I think this is the only lens that they sell on their website. I think the CS mount camera is the best option to go with. So you can buy it with the lens that has a zoom option for it. So another thing about this camera, which is worth keeping in mind, is that the back of the camera has a joystick type of button, and these can be used to adjust various things without actually accessing the Zowie UI. And they have different options depending on the camera which you've bought out of these three. And it's mainly about how you do the focusing and exposure. So another thing I wanted to touch on was the microphone. So the camera doesn't have an built-in microphone, so you have to connect the microphone to the line-in. But I don't think the line-in actually will provide power to the microphone. So you want to have a microphone which either doesn't require power or is powered from an external source. So just keep that in mind, that when you're using this camera, you want to have a microphone with it. And when I did actually unbox the camera, there was a cold shoe that came with it. So that would be a good option to attach that cold shoe on top of the camera and then insert the microphone into that cold shoe and then run that into the audio line-in of the camera so that you make sure your live stream also has audio. So that's pretty much everything about this device. So let me know if you have any questions or if you want me to do any further comparisons between this and the encoder, or if you have any questions around how to live stream to YouTube using this camera.